Dorothea Dix Park work session today, so we'll start off.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Hold on a minute.
Oh, no.
Give me a D.
D.
Give me an I.
I.
Give me an X.
X.
What do we got?
Dix.
What do we love?
Okay, did you get that in the official minutes? Okay, that is good.
So we have some
Thank
excitement.
you, Mr. Goodman.
We have some excitement this afternoon. We're going to spend a little time working through the excitement of the February 19th, where Council approved the master plan for Dorothea Dix Park, revisiting July 2nd when we came back and started talking about the proposed new framework for a memorandum of understanding. And here we are today where we want to have a stronger discussion about the MOU, the projects that are in Phase 1, and the Conservancy, which is proposed advancing some of those projects with Phase Now. We'll be back in a week to talk some more about implementation of Phase 1, finishing up with October 15th. And by that point, we will have recommendations to you for guidance. So today's agenda, we will introduce the Phase 1 proposed projects to you. We'll talk about the next memorandum of understanding with the Dorothea Dix Parks Conservancy. We'll hear from what they propose as an activation or advancement of some projects. And we'll talk about future resource impacts. We're at that point when moving forward has impacts not just on the Parks Department, it has impacts citywide. So that's how we're going to guide the conversation today, carrying over to the next two work sessions. As a reminder, on July 2nd, we outlined the purpose and intent of the current MOU. We presented kind of a high-level outline of the components of the existing MOU. And you authorized us to begin that work for the next MOU between the City of Raleigh and the Conservancy. So at this point, I will turn the presentation over to Mr. Stephen Bentley. He'll guide us through the next set.
Thank you, Scott. Good afternoon, Mayor and members of Council. Scott framed this up really well. I'm going to cover sections about some of the Phase 1 projects, some of the work we've been doing on the MOU, and some of the discussions we've had with the Conservancy about advancing some of the work forward. So the master plan's built on 2 years of engagement, you've heard the number 60,000 plus people participating. It's bold, it's ambitious. And what we're talking about today is just Phase 1. We'll focus on the 7 projects. The purpose of doing that is to seek comments and thoughts and concerns from council members so our staff can go back and revise these scopes based on some of your input and community priorities. Just to remind the council, this is the first phase. We have multiple phases ahead. The master plan proposed 4 phases. Throughout the series of years that lie ahead of us. We've spent a lot of time the last few months since the master plan has been adopted identifying partners, possible agencies that we need to work with, both regulatory and others. And this helped guide some of the scope that we're going to share with you today. In addition to that, over the 2-year period or more, we've created this universe of stakeholders. There's a lot of people interested in this park and how best we can engage with them as we move through the master plan. Before I start, the number one set of partners we work with is other city departments. We've had a lot of help and a lot of collaboration with the planning department, the public utilities department, engineering services, stormwater and construction management, city attorney's office, budget and finance. So this project is a city project by far. Although you have parks up here standing in front of you, this is a city effort. So, if you see the format of the slide, I have 7 of these slides to identify each of the projects. And I'm going to highlight a few points on each of the slides, but I'd encourage you if you have questions or comments. Whoop. Oh, I skipped one, the most important one. Thanks. This format we're going to use identifies size and scale, some of the amenities, and the goals of the specific project. So we'll start off with the Gateway Play, Destination Play, which is along Lake Wheeler Road. The purpose of this is to create an iconic play gateway along Lake Wheeler Road that's welcome to everyone. In addition to play, we see gardens and parking and public art and fountains, the possible reuse of two of the historic houses that are on site, known as Buffalo and Benner. We actually have a local architect looking at each of the historic structures that we'll talk about today to see about the suitability and possibility of repurposing these. In the corner of the slide, you'll see we will bring to you at your next council meeting different studies. Of course, today you're going to see the Dix Edge study, but these studies will parallel some of the projects. So if we're looking at a gateway along Lake Wheeler, it is very important that we're working with transportation and working with planning on that edge of the park and in the scope of this project. So the creek and the landfill improvements, this is one of the most complex projects I think the city will ever undertake. Working with our regulatory agencies both at the state and local levels, there's a lot of enthusiasm for the project. Like the entire master plan, it's bold and ambitious. We're looking at working with an existing landfill, but key features will be to open up the creek, have a series of pathways, stormwater detention pools, allow a waterfront for our downtown. In addition to that, there's a lot of focus on the creek, but it also recommends a series of multi-purpose fields and parking, which would coincide on top of the landfill. So things that we're going to bring to you in the future is a lot more work needs to be done to determine the scope of this project and help refine costs. We're also working with the Public Utilities Department. They're looking at the possibility of a water main line around or through the park, as well as replacing a sewer line that runs along Rocky Branch. The Land Bridge, a lot of discussion of one of the most iconic features of the plan. This is a way for the park not only to connect to Governor Moorhead and Pullen, but all points north, all the way up to Hillsborough Street, and then through the park. It's a seamless green space between multiple destinations of downtown. We see walking trails, planted areas, and bikeways. Currently, we're working with the NC Department of Transportation. They have agreed to do some in-kind services to look at some preliminary designs and what we would need to undertake to accomplish such a project. We're also working with Transportation and the Planning Department on the Western Boulevard BRT analysis. So this project, in addition to creek and transportation, just has a lot of moving parts. The Lake Wheeler multi-use path, it's a way to connect the point of South Saunders, which is down near the Western Boulevard Bridge, up through the historic Grove, in through the play space, and down towards the farmers market. It'll have walking paths, trailhead. The rendering you see here would be standing at the point at the South Saunders corner where the current trailhead is. So it's a way to open up the creek and then create a multi-use path that seamlessly connects Rocky Branch and the Walnut Creek Greenway. And then the historic entry of the park, which is Boylan Avenue. Currently, the master plan outlines us looking at 3 of the historic structures. As I mentioned earlier, we have a local architect that's looking at the integrity of each. There's a lot of interest and priority in looking at the All-Faith Chapel, as well as the superintendent's home. So in addition to a historic entry, we also are focusing on gardens, seating areas, and restrooms. So as you come in off of Western Boulevard, it would be reflective of more of a historic and culturally important gateway in the future. And then the cemetery, which we consider probably one of the highest priorities moving forward. It honors those that are buried there. The current status is what we're doing is working with the Historic Cemeteries Board, part of the Parks and Recreation Department, and looking at ways to interpret and develop a place of reflection and remembrance. We're looking at seating and shade and plantings, a way to honor those that are currently buried there. And then overall, we actually are calling the utility improvements. It's all 118 acres of Phase 1. We need to look at where the park is going from a total infrastructure perspective. So we're going to recommend a master plan that would look at all utility improvements for the entire park. So Bill, if you can consider, the park was built well over a 150-year period, so we have to replace water, sewer, and stormwater, and do that in a way that sets the tone for sustainability as we move forward. So I went through all 7 projects. I'm going to pause here and see what questions council members may have related to each of those 7, and I can go back to where you want to start.
My question goes back to utility improvements. As far as the funding for that, would that be a partnership with our department, looking at grants from there, or would it be looking from parks funding?
Yep. So right now we haven't determined the funding for the studies. We'll bring those back in future work sessions. One thing that I can identify is we're parks professionals, but we're going to see experts in the city. So if we're looking at stormwater infrastructure and water and sewer infrastructure, those projects will be co-led or led by the different utilities. We'll bring to you recommendations in the future on how we would want to fund the master plan of that utility infrastructure.
And then also my last question, as far as utilities, as far as looking at the water and sewer, are we also going to look at technologies to make it kind of a Wi-Fi friendly park?
Yeah, so we'll look at the full spectrum: water, sewer, gas, and basically set guiding principles for what we aspire to be on the park. So are we going to use solar? Are we going to use other means of generating electricity? So the overall master plan will look at how we can create a sustainable park, both from water, sewer, stormwater, as well as electric and gas.
I have a question about the most glamorous part of this park. Yeah, the landfill.
Yeah.
Can you provide a little bit more information on what the plan is for that right now?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we have worked for about 5 years in meeting with the landfill staff at the state of North Carolina. They're in a post-closure assessment, which means they were required to assess the condition and the extent of the landfill, so we think we know exactly where the landfill stops and starts. And what they've done is they have developed a remedial action plan, and they're really waiting for us. So what they have generally agreed to at this point in time is, as we come up with our plans to, we'll say, move dirt and manipulate the waste, we would only want to do that once. So if they have a bucket of money and we come with a bucket of money, let's do it together. The bright side of things is that the state is looking at this as a possible innovative and case example of how you can use landfills differently versus just planting grass and walking away. We've done a lot of work as a part of acquiring the park. We did testing. So literally we have thousands of pages on what exists, but I would put an asterisk next to that. Until you dig, we won't know exactly what exists there. But we're getting more confident as we move forward.
And the plan is to remediate on site, not to excavate, haul to another community, right?
We have not developed that strategy.
Okay.
We will bring that strategy back to
I
you.
am quite interested in that strategy as we think holistically about accessibility and equity in developing this park, that we don't take our waste and dump it on another community.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
In terms of the utility master plan, since the master plan is a guiding document to tell us what's going to happen over a long period of time, how do you sketch out what a utility master plan looks like when you don't know exactly all the things that will come to the park over a 25-year period?
That's a great question. So I would say the basis of what we're going to do is look at the range of uses that are proposed in the master plan. So the first thing we want to do is recommend capacities that could handle that. So incrementally, as we develop or build the park out, we have put in infrastructure that has that capacity. So In some instances, we might oversize some water or sewer, but we'll look at the overall vision and the uses of the buildings and the grounds, and that would help drive the intended infrastructure recommendations that we would put in the master plan.
So I think it's really important because the cost of this can get pretty high.
Yes.
And before we decide to do a lot of that, I think we really need to evaluate where we need it first.
Absolutely.
And then look at it over a period of time.
That's, the master plan utility master plan would intended to be phased. So there might be things in that master plan that never come into fruition, and it might be because of cost or change in the plan or the vision for the park.
Okay. Just be mindful.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? Okay.
Okay, we'll move on to the next section. So so one thing I want to know is, if you remember the red, I guess those are rectangles, we have a lot of plans and studies in the corner of each of those slides. At one of your next work sessions, we're going to talk about the plans and studies that help enable the work of those 7 projects. And that's related to work we're doing with DOT and work that we're actually working with RDOT, or Raleigh Department of Transportation. We'll talk a little bit more, since it seems to be a lot of interest in the infrastructure master plan, and then feasibility work. We need to get a lot more confident in taking on that creek project, so we're going to describe to you how we would approach doing some further feasibility on that project before we move forward. And then finally, how do we look at this project through the lens of equity, from programming to operation to actually how it's physically built. We have a framework which is in draft form that we would share with you, and we would ask you whether you would want us to proceed with an equitable development plan for the park. So that's future. Similar to the 7 slides that I shared with you on the projects, I'm now going to go through slides related to the status of the MOU. We have spent the last couple of months meeting with Conservancy staff and talking about long-term and short-term needs. So today, as I bring up slides, please provide feedback either during it, or I'll also pause at the end. So, purpose of the MOU is to affirm our continued partnership between the city and the Conservancy. It provides a framework for implementing the master plan. Pardon me. And it also lays the foundation for community engagement and philanthropy to help support a future capital campaign. What we foresee and are looking at is an umbrella agreement that talks about our aspirations, our shared values and beliefs. And then on a project-by-project basis, we would come back to the council and develop a specific agreement related to a project or initiative. So the Conservancy is going to raise funds. What does that agreement look like for those funds to contribute to projects? Certain building renovations, as you'll see in the next couple of slides, the opportunity for naming rights and how we have both joint and separate communications. So naming rights. We have a naming policy for parks, but we don't have a naming rights and sponsorship policy for parks. So an example is we typically name parks based off of geography or honorarium after people. But if someone wants to donate to a park structure or a park development, we do not have a formal policy in place to do that. And our recommendation is to come up with one so that we can help facilitate fundraising opportunities for the Conservancy. The current term of the MOU is 5 years. We have about 15 months left in the current MOU. What we're looking at now is a minimum of 10 to 15 years. The reason why we chose 10 to 15 years is that it parallels the first phase of park development. It clearly establishes that we aspire to have a long-term relationship with the Conservancy, and it helps the Conservancy work with donors to point to a long-term relationship, which hopefully leads to fundraising and donations. And the existing committee structures. So in the first MOU, we established the Executive Committee, which comprised of 8 members. It helped facilitate the partnership between the Conservancy, helped lead the master plan process, and then made recommendations to the council. The second committee was the advisory committee. It was comprised of 45 members that was appointed by the council. It advised on the master plan development, helped with community engagement, and ultimately made recommendations to the executive committee. What we're looking at now is taking the executive committee and we'll say evolving it into what we're calling the leadership committee. It's going to steward the partnership, the public-private partnership between the city and the Conservancy. It's going to help guide implementation with input from the community committee, which was formerly the advisory committee. And it's going to help build relationships with other organizations and leaders throughout Raleigh and the state of North Carolina, and ultimately provide recommendations for the council to consider. The community committee was formerly known as the advisory committee. We see representing the diverse interests and backgrounds within the community, advising on the implementation of the Phase 1 projects, and helping facilitate community outreach and engagement. Ultimately, the community committee will make recommendations to the leadership committee. So our goal today is really to get insights and thoughts and comments on committee structure from council and mayor, and then we would bring back to you a few options to consider. So although this is at a high level, we're trying to get some feedback for you. We've come up with some models, but we would, before we bring them forth to you, we would like to hear your thoughts further. Things related to the committee size, makeup, roles and responsibilities. We heard a lot during the master plan on improving the communication between committees. So I'm going to pause there and see what questions and comments you have.
What's the current size of our the advisory committee?
The 45.
45.
The community, it's now called the community, but it's more the grassroots and back.
So how would you reassemble that committee? Bringing new people on board, bringing people who'd been in some of the subgroups before to help facilitate a way to look at the park differently than we've looked at before?
Yep. So not set in stone. Some of the ideas we had is bringing forth for continuity some of the current advisory members, but also adding to where we feel like we didn't have we'll say strong advocates for certain areas of the community, increasing diversity. So we believe maintaining that number is a good number because we usually get about 75 to 80% that are actually really active. But we do think as though we can improve on some of the skill sets and diversity within the advisory committee.
So 45 is a good number?
Yeah, we feel as though, yep. It's a big number, but it's with this size of project, we feel as though we could create some smaller committees within it.
Stephen, so would you determine that if somebody didn't show up, if they didn't engage? I mean, how do you make those determinations about who those 45 need to continue to be or not be? And if you find that there are people who didn't perform at the level that you thought perhaps would needed to be, you remove them and then you look at the other committees that were subcommittees to try to fill in some of those gaps with skill sets that you need or that you know you need now that you didn't know before? Just a little bit more information about how you're going to do that.
Honestly, we don't have it fully baked, just to be transparent.
Okay.
What we have looked at is people who were active. So we knew who came to the meetings. We had people retire, people move, people graduate, and we actually had someone who passed. So looking at the active members, looking at where we were not sufficient in maybe representing the arts or ADA and accessibility, filling in skill sets that are definitely specific to Phase 1. So maybe we increase skill sets related to play and people with backgrounds in ecology and stream ecology. So, but still maintaining a broad representation of interest on history and athletics and community and neighborhoods, but making those adjustments so that they focus on the Phase 1 scope of work. Is that helpful?
For now.
Question.
Okay.
Of your 45, with an estimate, not the exact, about how many of them were active? 30. Okay. So
That's about
you
right.
have
I
15.
said 75, 80, I was pretty
So
close.
you have 15 vacancies right now, roughly, if you were to go. Okay.
Well, and do those people that did it, you don't know that,
How many
we're
want to return?
assuming they want to keep
Right.
working.
Right. I think, honestly, what's going to happen is we'll talk to some individuals that weren't as active, and when they find out that they may not be moving forward, they're going to say, I'm going to be active. So a lot of this is going to come down with individual conversations with those advisory committee members, but we clearly have some deficiencies in youth, deficiencies in accessibility. So we know some things that, and especially if we cater this to some of the phase one work, we know that we need to make some adjustments.
But that actually, most boards usually look at a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 rotation anyway. So if we're at 15, that kind of roughly falls into that.
Yeah,
Because that way you keep some of the historic part and you get
Yes.
new ideas. And so I think the key is, for one, just find out how many true spots currently you know for sure are vacant. And then we look at filling that number, and then what's left. See, you may have some that have been extremely active.
Yes.
But they may want to pull back.
Right.
So I think find out how many still want to continue, find that number, and then we see where the deltas are.
You pointed out something real well, like looking at terms, looking at some type of charter or informal agreement to become of the committee. We were less formal when we did the master plan, but now that things are getting real and we're going to look to capitalize on some of these skill sets, we'll look at rotation and time frame and length. So.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, two things I'm super interested in terms of the makeup of this board. One is that it's representative demographically of our
Yes.
city.
Yes.
So I hear you saying that, and I just want to emphasize that yes.
Absolutely.
So I think that's got to be a priority. I'm also really interested in what you just said about board term limits. I think that's crucial in terms of making sure that we have new leaders who are constantly being built and coming to the table and finding ownership over Dix Park for the longevity of the project. And I'd be very interested in kind of y'all's thoughts and processes on how we do that. I'm also very interested in what y'all and the Conservancy decide on what are the other characteristics of board members you're looking for, whether or not this needs to be a very fundraising heavy board, or if that's more on the Conservancy side of things. But I can't wait to hear what y'all bring back.
Yeah, honestly, in putting this presentation together, these 3 slides, I know you'd want to talk about the most. So.
Yes.
So in terms of engagement, I know
Yes.
there'd been a process or a conversation going on after the last engagement that we might re-look at what engagement looked like before, where we had not necessarily failures, but we could have done better, and maybe restructure how that looks. Have we done that process yet?
We actually have, and we actually have a community outreach plan, which we can share with you in one of your next work sessions. We did kind of that self-evaluation and talked to some of our project partners and said, where could we have done better, and built upon that. So I would say that as we move forward, like any project in a learning experience, we need to evolve and adapt to provide processes that are reflective of how we want the project to develop as we move forward.
Thank you.
How are the Dix 306 people included in the in these committees? What representation from?
I do not have the current exact makeup, but Bill chaired the advisory committee. We can share that with you as a follow-up.
Okay.
On the existing 45, there was 306 members.
Okay.
And also, we have lots of coffees, breakfasts, and discussions with friends of and 306.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But there were none on the executive committee, though, right?
No.
Okay.
Any other questions? I'm going to move to the next. The next topic is the proposal from the Conservancy. So over the last few months, as we've talked about the MOU, the Conservancy has expressed interest in supporting moving forward with certain projects that were identified through the master plan process that were identified as priorities. We're going to refer to those as Phase Now. The Conservancy has proposed to fund 100% of $7 million over 18 months, and they are earmarking those towards multiple projects. $2 million to advance the design of the Destination Play and Gateway project, $2 million for the rehabilitation of the All-Faith Chapel, $1 million to renovate, which would become a public space, $1 million to renovate the superintendent's house to be first floor public space, second floor Conservancy offices so that they could have a home on site. $500,000 in what they're calling early impact projects. So trails, restrooms, benches, signage, ways to make the user experience at the park in the short term much better. And then $500,000 in general planning and project management, and then $1 million in contingency. This is a map that shows the locations on site. You can see that they reflect my earlier set of slides that were some of the projects that I highlighted in Phase 1. The gateway along Lake Wheeler, the historic entry, which included the chapel and the superintendent's cottage. We just have some pictures at the bottom showing some possible improvements and then general planning support. So possibly some of the studies that we'll bring to you could be funded by the Conservancy. And then why Phase Now? So all of these projects would be recommended to move forward while feasibility of items like the creek and the landfill are underway so that we could advance the design of the Destination Play. It provides the Conservancy to, the opportunity to support the city in the Phase 1 projects. It fulfills all three master plan principles, which is really important. Open up and connect, build from what's there, and offer something for everyone. And then as a part of some of their recommended early impact improvements, it provides new amenities to the park. I'm going to pause there and allow you to ask questions. And then if you have questions for our Conservancy board members, as you can see, we have an audience. And I'm sure some of them will be happy to take some questions as well.
Can you go back?
Yes, sir.
To the, yeah, right.
That one? Okay.
Looks pretty good.
I was going to say thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah. And I like it because we're opening up the park now, Phase Now, so that, as some of these bigger items that have to go through the governmental process that may take, a little longer, this is showing to the community, here's the park for you to use, and as we work through the phases, so thank you.
Does anybody have any other questions? If not, I'm going to turn it over to Scott. Scott's going to talk about, as we move forward, how we have to look at how these projects impact us as an organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Stephen says it's getting real. and moving these things forward makes it real. You tip that domino, all those other things occur. And those are our needs for support, need for resources, need for staffing. Who does the work of the projects? If you move forward, how is that funded? All, as Stephen mentioned, it's a city impact, not just Parks Department. Public utilities, engineering services, transportation, all city departments are impacted by this tremendous project. But there is an impact, and how do we fund that? We've not yet determined how to fund that. We have to be creative. Is it something done that's city-based? Is it a partnership with the Conservancy? Some analog where maybe we together bring in a firm to manage all of it? We're not sure yet, but we know these resources are going to be needed. And we're going to have to continue to investigate that as we move forward, and that's starting now. 2021, if you move forward with phase now, you have some structures in place, but things starting to happening. Additional operations and maintenance responsibility. Who cares for a destination playground? Because once you build it, they will come, and you have got to keep it in great shape. Again, multiple departments impacted. How do we support that? How do we resource that as a city? I always get the fun slides, sorry. And then in 2025, midterm, we may begin to receive a significant number of buildings from the state. And those buildings have to be cared for while we determine which ones stay and which ones have to go, but they have to be cared for. There'll be partial completion of phase 1 projects. Again, ongoing programming needs, utilities, grounds, additional staff will be needed. Multiple departments will be impacted by this. Which brings for you the challenging key policies questions. What are the long-term roles and responsibilities between the city and the Conservancy? Of that array of projects, which projects and plans are your highest priority, and what are the critical next steps to move them forward? And how will the immediate, midterm, and long-term operating and capital needs be funded given all the needs across the city? These are the questions for you to ponder and think about, and then we'll be coming back and we'll be making some recommendations, but we want to get this in front of you now because it will have an impact, and you need to be aware of that. So next steps. We've gotten your feedback. Thank you very much, because staff will go back. We'll keep working on our proposals, integrating what you've brought to our attention. We'll continue negotiation of a long-term MOU with the Conservancy. We'll look at drafting a set of agreements to formalize the Conservancy's phase now projects. And we'll explore options that we've been doing to address resource impacts and then bring that back to you for your consideration. So that's what's coming to you over these next 2 work sessions. So like I said, we'll be back in a week, and we'll talk about supporting plans and studies. So you have at your side, I was remiss not letting you have a little cheat sheet you can keep track of, so it's easier to take notes on, maybe a little easier than the whole PowerPoint. We'll be coming back talking about some of those supporting plans and studies that are highlighted there. And we'll dive deeper a little more into the phase 1 project work. And then October 15th work session, we'll be following up, discussing your priorities and recommendations on how we move forward. And that is the schedule we have to move forward.
I have one question. When you say staffing needs, is there a rough estimate number?
We have a range of scenarios. We will narrow that coming back to you.
Okay.
We will narrow that because we're looking at it as a city project and the different ways to do it. At one time, we have 8 different options of what we might do. So we'll try to narrow that down when we bring it back.
Because the engineer me is the first question I ask is what is worst case?
Right.
So I would definitely I think that'll help us.
And some of that also becomes down to what you choose to move forward. Okay. Will also have an effect. Yes, ma'am.
When do we reevaluate our design team?
So as we move forward with looking at the different phases of the park, or I'm sorry, the different studies, we'll bring options to you on whether you want to go out and hire a new firm to do the feasibility of the creek and look at the play. But that will come at the last work session. We weren't going to discuss it today because we didn't put the options for you on the slide.
Just asking.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'd like to get some more details about organizationally for city staff. I mean, what I hear you describing is that you're involving other departments like transportation, public utilities, and so forth, which makes sense. But it's a very matrixed approach. Is there any advantage to having a department that's dedicated to Dix Park?
So that is one of the options we're looking at for our first approach is leveraging the set of skills we have internally. Was the matrix model. You know, we talked with engineering services, stormwater. Would they be able to lead the creek? Because that's their area of expertise. There would be, we would consider having someone from parks kind of overseeing a little bit because there's continuity then across all the other projects. So that's how we've initially looked at the models we've been approaching.
Okay.
I think we should, Mr. Cox, though, I think it's an interesting question. I think we need to remind ourselves that Dix is part of our park system, and we have many parks in the park system who all need to be taken care of. So I think we need to be mindful of that.
It wasn't to suggest that we would shortchange any of the other parks. It has to do with organizationally how you're going to manage things. And in particular, it's not just a park, it's also a project. Actually, it's a series of projects. And so it kind of begs a question of, you're going to have all these other departments involved for sure, but how are you going to coordinate all that activity? And it might make sense to have you might not have a Dix department, for example, that has its own transportation department or its own utilities department, but maybe there should be a Dix core group to be able to help coordinate, actually would coordinate all those other activities. That's the part I'm not clear about, is how you have a
So we
organization to oversee everything.
So one of the ideas that you may be a little early display of what our thought process is if you're familiar with how our strategic plan model is, there's a core stat team around, like transportation and transit, growth and natural resource. We're thinking about that might be a good approach for us to use for the project management of phase one.
Okay.
That's what it's a model that we're familiar with. It has a good synergy. And so that's something that we're looking at leading, where there is a group of core people.
If you could just provide details then about how that would work, that would be useful.
And I think on that 15th, when we come back with proposals, we would probably bring that to show how that organizationally would lay out.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is that it?
Next steps.
Oh, let's go. Okay.
So I'd like to be back in a week, and then come back the 15th with all of these recommendations that we've mentioned.
So, Mayor and Council, the second item on your agenda is the Dix Edge Study presentation from City Planning. So there's two items today. This is your second one. So, ready to move to that?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Mayor and Council, while they're rearranging for the presentation, I did also want to just take a moment to say thank you, and I believe Councilmember Cox stole that thunder a little bit, but this presentation, as well as some of the project work in advance of this, is the result of a core team. Last week, we spent about a half day out actually at the park with representatives from a lot of those departments brainstorming. And so it was facilitated by parks, but had engineers and planners from other departments involved, bringing into it their expertise. And so I just want to say thank you to the staff for coming together on thinking about this. This is a big project, and it's going to require lots of different departments. So I really appreciate that question. I want to thank staff. I also did want to take a moment to say thank you to the representatives from the Conservancy who have been working with the staff, and particularly for their Phase Now proposal. I do think that's something that's really worth considering. A couple of years ago, as a point of privilege, one of the Conservancy members, I won't identify who, asked, what was, our big idea, and my response is, how are we going to pay for it? And so several of the elements of their Phase Now proposal is them stepping forward with representation of willing to take risk. And I think in any public-private partnership, that is important. We haven't solved all the questions, but that is an important step. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon. That was actually a fantastic transition to our portion of the presentation, so I appreciate that. We just heard a lot of excitement from Stephen and from Scott about this transformative project. We also heard the gravity of this project, which we're going to continue to talk about with this part of the program. So I'll speak very briefly at the beginning of this presentation and be available for questions. The efforts for planning for Dorothea Dix Park do not stop at the boundaries of the park edge. So what you're looking at here is a map that shows the park in the center. It's shown in that yellow hue on your map. But around you see the white space. Those represent different planning projects that are either underway now or on the horizon, either by the city of Raleigh or other entities. So we've got the Western Boulevard study that's kicking off now, the EDAT, what we call the EDAT study, the development around transit. There's also a very large portion of property held by NC State that they call the Spring Hill area that is on the precipice of a planning project. And then on the southern edge, south of Lake Wheeler, is what we have proposed as the Dorothea Dix Edge study. So literally surrounding the park, we have a number of different planning processes that are underway. So as with any area study, there are issues and opportunities for us to discuss. And this project has some unique opportunities and issues for us. The first, I think, is one that I'll underscore. The presence of naturally occurring affordable housing around Dorothea Dix Park is a conversation that we will have during this planning process. It's a very serious conversation that will need our attention and our full attention. Carolee, Fuller Heights, Carolina Pines, all of these neighborhoods that have existed for quite some time that will feel the pressure of development of this landmark property. The area is near downtown, it's next to downtown, yet it feels cut off. There's infrastructure that I won't say is in the way, but it serves its purpose, but it does serve as a boundary. So the railroad that runs through the property, Western Boulevard, Martin Luther King Boulevard, also a very hard boundary, and then Centennial Parkway. So these three pieces of infrastructure really frame the park and the edge study. A large landholder in the area is North Carolina State. There's the university, farmers market, prison, and Governor Moorhead School, which represent very large properties. Again, a unique opportunity in this planning effort. And obviously, the Greenway and Open Space Network is of paramount importance here. So all that being said, here are a couple of snapshots of news stories. Obviously, since park acquisition, there has been increased interest in the area. So we see some increase in land transaction. We see increase in change in entitlement for properties around the area. This map actually does a really good job of illustrating that. So over the course of the past 5 years, each one of these colors represents a different year through time, and it identifies the change in ownership. So if there have been land transactions shown by year here. We also have a number of very high-profile zoning requests along the corridor. And I'll point a few out for you. Along Maywood Avenue on Highway 70, there was a recently filed zoning case for a 12-story request. There is also another very large rezoning request that happens that's been filed for Dawson and South Saunders split for a planned development for a very ambitious development pattern there. So all this to say that there is a phenomenal amount of interest in this area. So the planning process for us will be extremely important as we have these conversations. So just to wrap up, where this came from, there was a question from the table about performing this type of study, and there was a budget note that was requested in November that was ultimately approved in June of this year. So staff has been authorized to move forward, and we thank you for the inclusion of that budget note. There was a $300,000 amount that was placed into our budget to help us with consulting fees, which we are very thankful for. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who is our project manager, and she's going to talk about the scope of the project, and we're going to end the presentation with a critical question for you about how we move forward with any type of involvement in group.
Good afternoon, Mayor and members of Council. I'm here to talk to you about 2 items, the first being some phases in our draft scope of work, and I'd like to start out by mentioning that there was a draft scope that was provided in your packet that provides a little more detail on some of the items that I'm going to go over. But to touch upon some of the features that we felt were unique to this process, we proposed in this scope to start out with a robust public outreach and listening session. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with all area plans. We start out with the public outreach phase. However, we recognize that the community that makes up this area is fairly diverse, and that given the different folks, that there are a number of large landowners, religious institutions, a variety of people living in there, that there may be a large cross-section of folks who haven't necessarily sat down at the table to chat about some of the issues that we're going to be discussing throughout the process. So our thought in beginning this was to start out with a robust public outreach and listening session, followed by some items that may look more familiar to you through the typical area planning process. I also wanted to highlight numbers 4 and 5, that other items we were looking to explore were a housing workshop series, and the idea behind this was we understand there are a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing areas in the study area, and that we would get a roundtable together with affordable and market rate housing developers to explore some of the tools that we could put on the table in front of the public to look at together as we go through the planning process. The same thought applies to the public design workshop series that would be another proposed phase of the scope. We understand with the investments in the park as well as in BRT in the area that the makeup could change, so part of this planning process could be to explore the urban design and feel by, again, holding workshops with relevant members of the public where we would explore these issues together. Let's see, I apologize. I zoomed back over. This was the initial one that we were wanting to address to give you the big picture of the topics addressed in the scope. So I gave you a preview in the slide and now scan back to this. So to follow up on what I was just mentioning to you, the big topics that we'd like to address in the scope of work first are to look at equity and displacement, since I think we have an understanding here that the investment in this area could cause some changes. So part of the planning process is to look at how we can address issues of equity and displacement and discuss that with how the community would like to see us address that. The same holds true for housing affordability. That's a topic that we understand is quite pertinent right now, and that would be something specific to address in the scope of work, as well as some topics that you're probably more used to seeing, such as land use, development form, and things of that nature. Again, the proposed phases in the scope of work that include the items that we just touched upon. Followed by, we have a potential study timeline. So to start, we were looking to have a guiding group selection, and that's part of our conversation, and what we're bringing before you today is to look at what the guiding group could look like, and the timing of that was thought December could be a reasonable proposed starting date, followed by consultant selection coming after that. The visioning phase would then take place in the spring, and the idea would be big picture ideas with the community to sort of look at what do folks want to see in this area, followed by an inventory and analysis in the fall of 2020 that would look at what are the infrastructure issues, what are the assets, what's on the ground here today that we can take with that visioning phase, put these together and form a set of alternatives that we would then go back to the community with and present to see which alternatives best fit what they feel the needs for the area are. The alternatives generation we envisioned would be in winter of 2020 with a presentation to council in July of 2021. I'd also like to point out that we would be doing regular check-ins with council as well as any relevant boards and commissions along the way. This timeline is just to give sort of a big picture view of where we see some major milestones of the project going. The other piece that we wanted to bring forward was to talk about stakeholder engagement options, and this is part of our ask that Travis had previewed for me earlier today, that one option that we have used in previous planning processes that you might be familiar with is the confirmation group. A couple examples, we've used this in the Midtown St. Albans plan that's currently active, as well as the Falls North plan. Confirmation group would be, the goal is essentially for them to confirm that the planning process is on track. So that would be confirming that we are asking the public the right questions. Are we holding the meetings at appropriate locations and times for folks to attend? Things of that nature. They would also play a substantial role in helping with the outreach for the planning process. A second option that is available would be a steering committee. So this differs from the confirmation group format slightly in that the steering committee provides additional input throughout the process. While the confirmation group's role is to confirm that the process is on the right track, the steering committee would have more input throughout the process, but we envision that they would have a similar role to help with outreach throughout the process as well. The steering committee has been used before in the Downtown West Gateway plan, as well as the downtown plan, so just some examples. A third option is a business landowner focus, and this is currently being used in the Southeast Area Study as well as Capitol Boulevard. And previous examples include the Southern Gateway Plan and the Avon Ferry Study. This would be an emphasis on these specific stakeholders, so landowners and business owners in the area who may have input for the process. Additionally, and that we wanted to explore, as we know, there are a lot of stakeholders in this area who represent fairly different interests and backgrounds. So we have a beginning list of some stakeholders who would be added to the process, and I want to emphasize that this would be in addition to any of the previous types of groups that we presented. Some other options could include neighborhood leaders. Travis had mentioned there are a number of large landowners in the area. We also recognize there are a number of service providers in the area, as well as the Dix Park Conservancy. So this could be an option provided in addition to a previous group such as a steering or confirmation committee that would provide additional input throughout the process. We envision the public engagement process to have the big picture goal of bringing together groups who wouldn't otherwise interact. We understand it's a pretty large study area, and some of the stakeholder groups that I went through seem fairly different. Perhaps these folks have not gotten together to discuss their local planning issues, but we see that this could be a good opportunity to provide a roundtable for folks who might not otherwise interact from really all parts of the study area. And we just posted some examples here that there's a number of religious institutions, apartment complexes, there are a lot of local businesses in the area, and a variety of folks who we would like to set the table for a discussion throughout this process. So today's requested action is staff would like guidance on the appropriate group to proceed with for this process. So again, we discussed a confirmation group whose role would be to confirm that the planning process is on the right track. We're asking the right questions, holding meetings at appropriate times, and things of that nature. A steering committee who would provide more input than the confirmation group and steer the process, or a business landowner focus, which would be a more focused stakeholder group than the previous two. And just a refresher on the process. This is a process we've used for previous small area plans, that we place a call for interest and applications to the public. We identify relevant stakeholder groups, and we use those relevant stakeholder groups to use some type of matrix to generally display that the stakeholders represent a diverse cross-section of stakeholders. And finally, we would present the applicants back to you for final selection.
What's a guiding group?
A guiding group would be steering committee or confirmation group or business landowner group, the three groups that would provide some oversight for the process.
So, like the presentation, but this is like no other we've done before. And I think looking at what we've done before isn't just going to work here. I think we need to look differently at this project than what we see here. I feel like I'm getting a rebake of a lot of things we've done. It's a diverse group with a lot of people of different backgrounds who aren't going to necessarily, depending on what your outreach looks like, if you're going to use one we've used before. I'm not sure that there's going to be people over there who are going to be interested in getting involved because they're not going to understand what it is you're asking them for. So if we could maybe do a little demographic dive at the people who are living over there that we're talking about, and making sure that we have plugged in what it is they're going to need to feel like they're part of a process. Though I appreciate your effort, I think we've missed some of the mark here moving forward.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that as well. How many people in this area are renters, actually? And are we reaching out to them as well as the property owners?
Yes, that would be one of the goals, and at this phase of our presentation, we're providing a higher level of information than if we'd be specifically reaching out to renters, but we did envision that. As for the number of renters, I would need to pull up that information. I don't have that in front of me.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the concerns I have, I think we're going to see a tension between, trying to figure out how to involve all the right members of the various potential stakeholder group, and doing this in a timely fashion. The timeline shows, something coming back to council almost 2 years from now, July 2021, and I'm concerned about what's going to happen in that area in the interim. I don't have the answer to that, but I think somehow we need to figure out what can we do to accelerate this, but also how do we involve all the right people? And I don't have that magic answer, but I am real concerned about the timeline.
Councilman Crowder, would it be useful if they did a meeting, a kickoff meeting in that area, as one of the initial items to try to get engagement? Not the only, but one of the tools.
So, Mr. Branch, I don't know that that's my place to decide what that looks like. I believe that that's planning staff's.
Okay.
And I would say to you that I think you need to bring back to us something else that looks like it's reaching out to as many diverse people in this area as possible, and how you plan to do that. And coming back to me saying, well, we did this at Falls News or North Hills East is not working for me.
I think they're just talking about the structure of sort of the oversight group, that there's different ways to work through the process. It's a confirmation group, which I can't remember. There's one of them we did that worked really well. Looking at Travis. Or the steering committee, or the business landowner focus. I mean, I think obviously it's a lot bigger than business landowner. And I think a confirmation group may work best because it's really more of a group that part of their job is to make sure that everyone is included, that there is outreach, that it is comprehensive, that they're, they are touching landowners and renters and all those, you talked about transportation and housing and I mean, all these different pieces that are going to go into it. So just trying to give something to go forward on. That's just my personal recommendations as a confirmation group, and maybe after that, then that would give staff the ability to then come back with more details of how they plan to, all the different groups they plan to reach out to.
I tend to agree with Mayor on this and thinking about the confirmation group process as being the way forward, and I think it's on us to make sure that we are getting this opportunity out to all of the right stakeholders throughout the community, whether those renters and homeowners and business owners and so on, and just making sure that that confirmation group is representative, again, of those demographics in the region, to Ms. Crowder's point. So I'm very interested in the confirmation group approach, and then just making sure that we are very thoughtful on who's on that.
I think you'd need to come back. This is my personal opinion. If it's a confirmation group, great, but I don't know who that is because I don't think you guys have done enough dive to know who's over there and what kind of diversity we're looking at and how do we reach them. I don't see that here.
Well, I think that's what, when they come back with the list of the confirmation group, then it might, if there's a homeowners group or whoever it is, they would list out the people on that group and who they represent. And then that would give us an opportunity to look at that and say, well, you're missing this group or you're missing that group.
So I'm not ready to give you an answer today.
I have one question as far as the levels where you had inventory and analysis, that schedule. I see where the timing, when you say timing, is that when you look to have that part completed or when you look to have that part? I'm trying to understand I'm thinking the inventory and analysis part would be helpful in the visioning phase.
Sure. These dates are referring to a beginning of the process.
Okay. So just I'm thinking after we figure out what type of group we're gonna have and we have a consultant, when we talk about visioning phase, my thing is visioning phase, what do you want to see? And I think if we talk about what we want to see, we need to know what's there. And I think having that information prior to visioning will be helpful to the group.
Has there been any outreach to date as far as the residents in the area? Any flyers distributed or cards mailed to inform them of what we're thinking about? Or any of these future activities?
We've waited to conduct outreach to the public, getting confirmation from the council on the group that would be guiding this project would be helpful for staff to provide more concrete information to the public about the study.
Is there any way of sending something out prior to having that information, just to gauge the interest in the area of the residents in this process?
Absolutely. That would be staff's goal throughout the guiding group process, or apologize, before the guiding group selection process to do a solicitation of that nature. We can certainly explore reaching out prior to that.
I just think we have to be a little careful about, you don't want to put out information when you don't have answers. You know, if you're putting out flyers, letters, cards, whatever it is, but when people start expressing interest, but you're not able, their staff's not able to articulate what the process is going to be, that can be even more confusing. So I understand your desire to get some answers from us, and we do want to get everybody engaged early, but I think it's important that we have a structure and some concrete answers for people.
So might I suggest, Travis, maybe we could sit down together and have some conversation, and you could bring it back to our next work session.
Certainly, we'd be happy to. That'd be great.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, Travis. I'm hearing two conflicting concerns at this table right now, which is one, to Ms. Mendel's point, that we want to move this process along and not delay it any further. I'm also hearing, Councilmember Carter, your concern over making sure we have diverse stakeholders in the room. And I'm hearing Councilmember Cox say we need to go ahead and engage people. And I fear that if we push this off, we're going to be contradicting at least two of those pieces. And so I really want to urge us to go ahead and pick one of these structures so that we can go ahead and figure out who those diverse stakeholders are who will be engaging in this process that we need to go ahead and move on so we can maybe meet July 2021.
I agree with you, but I'm also want Councilor Crowder to be comfortable with the decision.
Well, I think the thing for me is that if you think one of these are the answer, but you can't tell me anything about the area and who's in it, I'm not sure that any of these kinds of principles of trying to reach them is the right one. I think, Ken, you've been there. You know that there's a lot of diversity there and a lot of people who hide in the shadows there. So I just want to make sure, we've never undertaken anything like this, and I think just re-putting together what we've done before is not the answer. And I'll be honest with you, I don't want to slow it down, but at the same time, if we're going to do it, we need to get it right.
Okay, so a couple of things. You may recall a presentation we gave at a work session some months ago where we gave a fairly detailed demographic breakdown of the neighborhoods around Dix Park and showed their diversity. There is a very large proportion of renter-occupied households, and there's a great diversity of incomes, but it's generally has historically been a lower income area with a lower price of housing, which is one of the things that the state is willing to look at. Let me phrase the question slightly differently. You can think about two types of ways of engaging when you have a lot of diverse stakeholders who don't see themselves as having a common interest in each other. One is to try to do a big tent process. We're going to bring all these people from these different backgrounds together into one process and have them interact with each other. And the other is kind of a negotiated process where we're going to meet with the state. What are their bottom lines? What are their interests? We're going to meet with neighborhood groups. What are their interests? We're going to meet with the social service providers, and the staff and consultants try to basically work out a compromise and consensus among these sort of groups that may not view themselves as having a common interest. I've seen both of those processes work well in different circumstances. But I think what we're trying to get at is, do we want to have a single oversight group that's selected and appointed by council that guides this process, and can we put that in place before we're actually launching it or not? And that's for the timing purposes. In terms of the details of exactly how the public outreach is going to go, we envision all sorts of different types of events and outreach methods that are beyond what we would normally do and that we're already doing. So for example, in the Southeast Area Study, staff went out and intercepted people along the News River Greenway Trail and talked to them about down in our USA and talk to them about their concerns for multimodal transportation. We've done pop-up events, we've gone to festivals, we've done all sorts of things, and we're planning to do similar types of things to outreach to this area as well. But a lot of those details will be worked out in the scope of work through the consultant selection process, the RFP process, and working that out. And I agree with you that it's absolutely critical that we bring some creative things to the table because of the diversity of the population, the fact that there are a lot of groups who are not historically engaged in city affairs who live in this area that we were going to try to engage. And a lot of creativity is going to have to be brought to bear for that. So at this point, in order to meet a reasonable timeline, we need to start thinking about how is this overall thing going to be structured? Is there going to be a council-appointed oversight group? When do we want to have them on board? And do we need to have them on board before we go through the consultant selection process?
I had a couple of questions or suggestions. With the some of the road improvement projects we started a new thing, or you all started a new thing with having a meeting at the 0% design phase, where we haven't even really come up with a design, but we bring the community together to talk about what might happen. And it seems to me that even though we don't have a lot of information about this, we know something's going to happen, and we might consider using that as a model for some early engagement. And the other thought I had was whether it would make sense to have, a couple of these different models, or maybe even all three of them, a steering committee and a confirmation group, and have them all take, different bites of the pie or something like that.
Okay. I think, although we have not received, a specific decision on the thing we've asked, we certainly received, I think, some very useful feedback from council at this meeting. And I do see the need to report back with some additional proposals and to put some additional flesh on the public process. And so we'll just have to work out a venue for when and how that comes back to you. But we will do it we will work with the manager's office in recognition of the fact that the timeline is important, that stuff is happening in the neighborhood right now, and we want to make sure that the study is timely.
The other question I have is, what are our ultimate goals for this area? Is it to preserve the existing housing and affordable housing in the area? Is it to set the stage for redevelopment? I'm not real clear what our overarching goal is.
We don't know. That's something that will be uncovered throughout the planning process. What we think, though, is that the rubric of preservation versus redevelopment is going to be problematic. There's enough real estate pressure here that even if you hold the line on zoning, it's very likely that a lot of the housing stock will turn over and be replaced. Sure. And so the question is, what is the form of that going to take? It's unlikely the neighborhood will not see any change. So if there is going to be change, what is the preferred form for that change, and what are the trade-offs for the different options? And we can't answer that question. We haven't done the process. We haven't involved the neighborhoods. So until we've done that, but I think that's one of the most important questions that we need to answer.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, anything else? Okay, then meeting's adjourned. Thank you.